welcome students to the lecture on topic Political Philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, Part 1. In this lecture, we will discuss life and works of Thomas Hobbes, the intellectual influences on Hobbes, the evolution and the development of Hobbes's political and intellectual life, how Hobbes worked and developed his political philosophy. And finally, we will discuss various themes covered in the major writings of Hobbes. Dear students, Hobbes is one of the greatest and influential thinkers of all times. He was born in 1588 in England. Born in the time when England was going through violence and troubles, Hobbes well claims in his autobiography that Fair and I were born twins. Hobbes lived a very eventful life. His intellectual life almost completely spanned the English Revolutionary period, that is, from 1644 to 1688. Few men have enjoyed longer and more eventful lives, and perhaps none so exceptional in qualities of body and mind as Thomas Hobbes. The Revolutionary period in England and the subsequent political turmoil paved the way for some great events. These events brought some great figures to the side, and Thomas Hobbes was one amongst them. His father, Thomas, was a clergyman with no concern for his children. All his children were taken care of by his elder brother Francis, who was a successful glove maker in Malmesbury. Hobbes began his school at the age of 4 and before leaving for Magdalen College, Oxford, had mastered Latin, Greek and arithmetics. The Magdalen College at that time was under the influence of Puritans. However, Hobbes was indifferent to these and devised his own methods and ideas that scored him the reputation of being an original scholar. He took 5 years to complete his graduation, which was more than the customary 4 years. After graduating in February 1608, Hobbes was hired as a tutor by William Cavendish for his son, who was to be the future Earl of Devonshire. This attachment to the Cavendish family continued for many years and was one of the great formative influences of his life. In 1610, it became his duty to accompany the son and heir of the family on a grand tour of the European continent. During the year of travel which followed, Hobbes learned French and Italian and came into contact with a number of leading continental scholars. This led to the discovery that the philosophy he had been taught at Oxford was considerably out of date, and inspired him to seek to remedy his deficiencies by an intensive course of study to which he applied himself for many years. His connection with the Cavendishes brought him into contact with Bacon, Ben Jonson and other English intellectuals, and thus supplied further incentive to intellectual endeavour. By the time Hobbes returned to England, the Reformation had already started. It was a period when a new radical way of looking at the world exigencies had already begun. As in terms of religion, it meant a complete rollout of the role of intermediaries between man and God, thus limiting the religion to a personal affair. And in terms of the politics, it meant a major change of looking and analyzing the political realities of the time. Thus, the Reformation was not simply a religious struggle. Its political implications were vast, and it was, in fact, the decisive factor in the emergence of the modern nation state. The Reformation resulted in civil war, that is, from 1644 to 1688 in England, between the beneficiaries of old order, nobility supporting monarchy, and the people pushing for change of power structure in favour of commons within the parliament led by Cromwell. This resulted in what is known as Glorious Revolution in 1688 as a result of which Parliament was established as the supreme authority and monarchy was reduced to a ceremonial status. These events and the politics around influenced Hobbes to a great extent, which is reflected in all his writings. In a way, he was responding to the insecurity and uncertain situation created during the Civil War, that is, reflected in his depiction of the state of nature. In the year 1629, Hobbes came with his first publication. It was the translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. After his first publication, Hobbes got well acclaimed among the scholars and left for another tour, this time only to get inspired by Galileo and Mazzini, the great scientists of his time, which was to shape his entire political philosophy to a greater extent. Upon his return to England, Hobbes wrote his first important philosophical work, The Elements of Law, only to be published later in 1950. But when Hobbes came back to England in 1637, the situation of the country was not the same as was when he had left. The Civil War had already started in there. As a royalist by association, Hobbes soon found it difficult to stay back in England and had to leave for Paris and choose to spend the next 11 years as a royalist émigré in France and Holland. While in exile, Hobbes developed interest in physics and mathematics, which eventually inspired him for his political theory with a new approach. In 1642, Hobbes published his first major political treatise in Latin with the title D7. This work was highly praised by its readers, who were first limited to the scholars only. The D7, though it contained the core of Hobbes's political thought, was a highly recondite work in Latin, not as yet in general circulation even among scholars. What Hobbes now proposed to do was to amplify and popularize this work so as to give it point with reference to the English Civil War. He did far more. When the new work entitled Leviathan appeared in 1651, it did not take long for the world to discover that an enduring masterpiece of political thought had been wrought. Thus, all that is memorable in the political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes may be found in D7 and Leviathan. Although Hobbes translated D7 into English as philosophical rudiments concerning government and society in 1651, almost in the same time when he came up with Leviathan. However, Leviathan was a more success as it brought out his most mature form of the political thought. As Leviathan is the major political thesis of Hobbes, it heightened his fame as a prolific political thinker among the scholars of his time and got him recognition as one of the greatest thinkers of all times. Therefore, Leviathan is important for understanding his political philosophy. Besides these, Hobbes also wrote other philosophical works like De Corp and De Homin. The publication of Leviathan also brought some contentious fame to Hobbes. With the views concerning the royalists of his time took a serious offence. Thus, Hobbes could no more find the support from his royalist friends and had to flee to England at once. This turned out to be the changing moment for Hobbes, and he devoted the rest of his life to science and philosophy. However, the fate had in store a little more fame for him as a public figure, actively involved in post-Restoration period, but this time a little more as an intellectual serving the movement. Restoration was the period that began in 1660, when the parliamentarians were again taken over by the royalists and the throne of England by Charles II. Being a close associate and acquaintance of Charles II, Hobbes once again found the royal favour. With this, Hobbes entered the last phase of his life, characterized by the philosophical and intellectual endeavours only to stop at his death in the 92nd year of his eventful life. They were years of incessant literary activity and of philosophical, mathematical, theological and political controversy. Hobbes died in the year 1679. Hobbes built his political theory while basing his arguments upon the different psychological, physical and metaphysical realities. Thus, in order to have an understanding of the political philosophy of Hobbes, it is important to analyze his views given in Leviathan as his metaphysical assumptions, physical assumptions and the psychological assumptions. Leviathan sketches a materialist metaphysics and an egoistic psychology from which a justification for the civil state is generated. Leviathan talks about nature and necessity of government, the obligations that subjects have to it, the relation of church to state and philosophy of Christian religion. Hobbes is a convinced materialist, utterly rejecting the supernatural and contending that all phenomena could be studied and understood in terms of finite natural forces. Hobbes is indifferent to the religious understanding. For him, religion is first the product of fear, of the unseen and uncontrolled, nurtured by different sets of people for different purposes. Since the reasoning and prudence of men is limited, as beyond a point men cannot imagine or predict, thus giving rise to the area of fear and subsequently a remedy for fear as religion. For a materialist like Hobbes, the spiritual becomes a mere ghost, a figment of the imagination. He does not deny that there is such a thing as revelation or as spiritual truths, but he is clear that there is nothing to say about them. Given his theory of sovereignty, Hobbes considers the spiritual or divine authority subservient to the temporal authority. For him, in order to maintain peace in state, any dispute between spiritual and temporal authority cannot be allowed, thus making only one supreme authority, and that is the temporal authority. Therefore, religion must be under the control of law and government as mentioned in Leviathan. Writing at a time of uncertainty and civil strife precipitated by the English Civil War, Hobbes developed the first comprehensive theory of nature and human behavior since Aristotle. He wrote about human nature, the behavior of man, and on the basis of these, the nature of the state. For Hobbes, the behavior of an individual is entirely the product of his inner nature and the external stimuli from their environment. For him, man is entirely the creature of circumstance, prone to every inconsistency of character that might result from the varied impulses set in motion by the manifold stimuli affecting his sensory apparatus. Capable of colossal errors of reason and judgment, violent storms of passion and abysmal excesses of iniquity, as well as of straight thinking, rational behavior and lofty virtue. Hobbes took a very firm position on the politics of his time. He was a strong supporter of absolute monarchy and an implacable foe of the Puritan revolutionaries. More than any other thinker, Hobbes invented the modern theory of politics, its methods, its language and its concepts. This theory was to be based upon empiricism, whereby the knowledge was to be constructed through observation and experimentation. However, this empiricism for Galileo and consequently for Hobbes was quite different, as it went beyond mere sensation to something more fundamental, that is, body and motion. Body refers to what we today call mass, the basic structure of matter out of which all things are comprised. Motion refers to the fact that mass is energized, that bundles of matter move ceaselessly through space unless compelled to become stationary by the resistance of other bundles of matter. Hobbes, by that matter, was an uncompromising materialist, mechanist and determinist. As a materialist, he believed that the only thing that existed was matter. As a mechanist, he believed that all causes operated by one object coming into contact with another object. As a determinist, he believed that every event has a moving cause that determines the effect. This, known as the new science by Hobbes and his contemporaries like Galileo, was a material science, and here universe was taken as a material reality understandable only in its material terms. It is from this perspective that Hobbes also tries to understand the human nature. Hobbes proposes to study human beings as a set of purely physical processes that are reducible to body and motion. And on the basis of these processes, Hobbes claims to have logically or geometrically deduced a scientific theory of politics. For Hobbes, human being is a creature of sense. All the movements of his sense organs create sensations that fills his mind and creates movement there that we know as ideas. Some left part of the sensations leave images in our minds, and the perception of these we know as imagination. The images in our mind create the mental discourse. This discourse becomes rational when the memory of the past relates with the experience of the present, and on the basis of these we anticipate future. Apart from these, according to Hobbes, there are two other kinds of motions, vital or involuntary and voluntary motions. The involuntary constitutes the basic motions like inhalation, digestion, respiration and circulation. That means all those motions that forms the physiology of human beings. The voluntary ones includes those motions that are willed and include the willingness and control of the individuals such as walking, talking, and of course Hobbes includes politics in voluntary motions. The voluntary motions actually are created in response to the ideas generated in our mind. Men deliberate and decide. That is where the willing comes in. When a decision is taken after deliberation, we concentrate on one object and thus we are said to will it. The continuous willing and achieving of our objects of desire, along with the security of obtaining them in future as well, is the success known as felicity. And in order to obtain felicity, men find it necessary to obtain power, which is the required means for achieving felicity. This condition of felicity makes man to move and obtain power. Therefore, in man there is a perpetual desire for power. Thus, politics for Hobbes is such an activity or motion among human beings that is social, and it is the voluntary motions that includes the subject matter of political science. But according to Hobbes, physiology is preceded by the psychological sense. Hence, for understanding any human activity, including politics, we must first have a proper understanding of the human psychology behind that activity, as he believes that all voluntary motions are initiated first at the psychological level. That means before any voluntary act or motion, one needs first to be clear of the psychological state of it. Before going for any act, we must know and will to do so. In fact, according to Hobbes, it is this knowing and willing that constitutes our psychological processes, as they are the internal voluntary motions that are caused by the outer stimulations. This gives rise to the mental discourse and hence the knowledge as well. Hobbes' ordering of mental discourse to follow sensation fits the normal scholastic view about knowledge. Sensations of individual objects are the atoms of thinking. When these are put together, the result is a thought. Both willing and knowing work upon the same physical principles according to Hobbes. The physical desires and the social desires, called as passions, comprises the willing, and these passions keep human body in motion, and these motions according to Hobbes are ceaseless. Yet while we continuously will many things, from food to social status, all of our desires flow from the same internal physiological motions. All of our passions are part of the same life force. This Hobbes terms endeavour, which he argues is nothing more than appetite and aversion, in effect the desire to attain pleasure and avoid pain. What all human beings will in general, in other words, is the maximization of pleasure and minimization of pain. As later put by Jeremy Bentham, who developed utilitarian school of thought upon this premise. For him, all the human acts are in reality based upon the principle of pain and pleasure, what we now understand as utilitarianism. For Hobbes, it is not knowledge that determines human actions. In the Hobbesian system, we first will something, that which we believe will bring us the greatest pleasure or the least pain, and use our knowledge accordingly. In Hobbes' view, in other words, we are driven by our passions and use our intellectual capacity simply as a means to determine what will bring us the greatest pleasure or the least pain. Since human beings' desires or passions are ceaseless, thus they continuously strive for happiness, which of course does not stop by achieving one, as it only paves for the another desire or object of happiness. Hobbes says the object of man's desire is not to enjoy once only and for one instant of time, but to assure forever the way of his future desire. And therefore the voluntary actions and inclinations of all men tend not only to procuring but also to the assuring of a contented life, and differ only in the way which ariseth partly from the diversity of passions in diverse men, and partly from the differences of the knowledge or opinion each one has of the causes which produce the effect desired. Although Hobbes concludes that for different people the objects of desire and the desires are different, depending upon various things like what the individual considers is happiness for him. However, it is also concluded that even though the individuals desire different things, the truth is that each individual desires. He also concludes that there is one thing that each individual desires, and it is the power. As he says, and I quote, "I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power, that ceaseth only in death, and the cause of this is not always that a man hopes for a more intensive delight than he has already attained to, that he cannot be content with a moderate power, but because he cannot assure the power and means to live well which he hath present without the acquisition of more." Therefore, it is evident Hobbes believes that man is a perpetual power seeker, and he attains and strives to attain power only for his own self, thus making him a self-seeking and self-regarding creature. Having examined the psychological states underlying voluntary motion, Hobbes is now prepared to discuss the outward forms of voluntary motion. Such a discussion constitutes political science for Hobbes. Not surprisingly, Hobbes' view of human nature has a profound impact on his political theory. His psychology of pleasure and pain greatly influenced his most important contribution to political thought, that is, his theory of the social contract. With these words, dear students, I conclude the first part of the lecture series on political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. Goodbye and God bless you.